Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They used to say my brother was born smiling, like even the damn delivery room lights couldn't make him squint. Mason had that look, all-American, sun-kissed, the kind of kid who made old ladies at the grocery store lean down and whisper to their husbands, "Now that's a boy raised right." I was 2 years older and invisible by the time he turned 5. Not in a metaphorical way, I mean truly, thoroughly, and systematically overlooked like a piece of furniture that had always been there, but somehow became background. If Mason got an A in math, it was a celebration with cake and a photo on the fridge. If I got the same grade, my dad would say something like, "Well, that's how it should be. You're the older one, after all." Our mom wasn't unkind, at least not openly. Her way of hurting you was softer, dressed in compliments that bent around you like a snake. "You're the responsible one, Cal. Mason needs more encouragement. You've always been strong, more self-sufficient." At 13, I mistook that for love. At 16, I started translating it for what it really meant. We don't need to love you as loudly. We grew up in a split-level house in Ohio. Not rich, not poor, just basic American middle-class suburban beige walls, a backyard with more weeds than grass, and a second fridge in the garage full of soda and beer for guests we rarely had. My father was a man of habit, which is just a polite way of saying he lived in routines that didn't have space for nuance or emotional complexity. He believed in straight answers, hard work, and boys who shook hands like men. When Mason cried, he pulled him into a hug. When I cried, he asked what I was trying to accomplish by it. By the time I was 18 and Mason 16, the roles were set in concrete. Mason was the athlete, the extrovert, the kid with a bright future in any direction he pointed. He played varsity football, dated the homecoming queen, won scholarships, and smiled with his whole face. I, on the other hand, got certified as a mechanic through a vocational program and took pride in being good with my hands. I liked engines, the predictable hum of work, the way a machine had no opinion about your worth. But it was never enough. One night, just before I turned 21, we had this dinner, one of those family events where everyone's dressed nicer than usual but no one says why. Mom had made roast chicken and baked mac and cheese, which meant she was trying to impress someone or soften something that was coming. Dad opened a bottle of wine, and Mason had just come home from college for the weekend. They kept calling it the celebration dinner, but no one told me what exactly we were celebrating. Until they did. Mason had landed another scholarship, a study abroad program in Spain, all expenses paid. A whole semester sipping sangria, walking cobbled streets, charming strangers in broken Spanish. My mother clapped like a child at a magic show. My father raised his glass and said, "To the one who makes us proud." I remember that phrase because it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything at first. I just smiled, a real, tight-lipped, lockjaw smile, the kind that hides blood behind the teeth. That night, I excused myself early, said I had work in the morning, which was true. I ran my own little auto shop by then, mostly oil changes and brake jobs, nothing fancy. No one mentioned it. No one asked how business was. Not a word about the certification I'd finally completed after 6 months of night classes while working 10-hour days. Nothing. It's funny how a person can get used to being passed over, can normalize it like some kind of emotional arthritis. You stop fighting it. You stop even noticing it. Until one day, someone says something that slices through the whole damn illusion like a jagged piece of glass, and you realize you've been bleeding for years. For me, that moment came 2 weeks later when Mason and I were both home again. We were standing in the kitchen, and Mom came in, face glowing, with her iPad in hand. She showed Mason this 5-star resort in Turks and Caicos. Ocean views, infinity pools, some kind of sea turtle excursion. "Your father and I want to take you there over spring break. You've worked so hard, and you deserve a real escape." Then she turned to me not even fully and said, Maybe next time, Cal. It was that phrase. That casual, almost sweet little lie. Maybe next time. Like I was a punch card away from affection. Like I hadn't spent my whole damn life earning a seat at a table that was already full. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I smiled again. Same tight smile. Same locked jaw. And inside, something stopped. Not in a dramatic, earth-shattering way, more like the soft click of a switch being turned off in a dark room you hadn't noticed was even lit. Mason said something like, "You can come too, right? I mean, we could all go." And Mom laughed, waving it off, saying something about logistics and cost and how it would be too much. My dad didn't even look at me. He was scrolling through the resort website, muttering, "Look at those beaches." And right then, in the soft hum of that kitchen light, with the smell of lemon cleaner and burnt toast hanging in the air, I made a choice. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't demand. I wouldn't even explain. I'd just make sure there wouldn't be a next time. Whatever little part of me had still hoped for something, a thank you, a pat on the back, a nod of acknowledgement, that part went silent. Permanently. And then came the trip. The one that broke whatever was left of me. The announcement didn't come with any warning, though by that point in my life I'd stopped expecting warning to mean anything more than another reminder that I wasn't ever really in the loop. They sprung it on Mason like it was a surprise party and he'd just walked into the living room blindfolded, except the whole house was cheering and I was just standing off to the side, holding a slice of stale cake. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where you don't expect much beyond coffee and maybe mowing the lawn if the weather cooperates. But my mom, in her usual overcompensating energy, had made pancakes with blueberries and set the table with the nice plates we only used for holidays or company. Dad sat at the head of the table like a king in jeans and a Cleveland brown sweatshirt, already grinning like he had a secret that was about to blow the damn roof off. Mason was halfway through pouring syrup when she dropped it. We booked a trip. Just the three of us. A full week at Coral Sands, Turks and Caicos. 5-star resort. Oceanfront suite. Mason, baby, you're gonna love it. I didn't say anything, not right away, because there was this moment, less than 2 seconds long, where I thought maybe I'd misheard it, maybe the words hadn't landed right in my ears. But then Mason's face lit up like someone had handed him the keys to his own kingdom, and my dad raised his glass of orange juice, clinked it against Mason's, and said, "You earned this, son. You really did." And me? I sat there, fork in hand, chewing on pancakes that suddenly tasted like cardboard, nodding like someone who'd heard good news and wanted to be happy for someone else. My mom noticed the silence and gave me that look, that half-apologetic, half-dismissive thing she did when she was trying to smooth over something sharp. "It's just something special for Mason," she said, not unkindly, you know, for everything he's accomplished this year. And then came the line. That line again. The one I'd heard too many times to count, but never stopped cataloging like tiny cuts that had healed wrong. "Maybe next time, Cal. We'll plan something. Just us. Promise." Now, I know what some people might say. You're a grown man. Why do you care about some vacation your parents took your younger brother on? But the thing about pain like that is it's not about palm trees or beach chairs or overpriced room service. It's about being reminded, yet again, that you were the extra, the standby ticket, the alternate, the just-in-case-we-can't-afford-you person in a family that always had room for one son and space for the other only when it was convenient. So I smiled. Not because I meant it, but because I'd become a professional at smiling when it was expected. I raised my coffee mug and said, "Sounds amazing, Mason. You're gonna have a great time." And the sick part is, I meant that not the praise, but the masking of whatever else was happening inside me, the dark little bloom of something that wasn't jealousy exactly, but something uglier and quieter. Have you ever been in a family where someone always got the better piece of the pie? Where you learned, early on, to be happy for others even when you were starving for a bite yourself? I'm curious, if you were in my shoes, would you have smiled too, or said something? Mason hugged our mom, then our dad, and when he reached out toward me, I stood up and clapped him on the back. That's how we were, not touchy-feely, not the kind to hug unless someone was dead or graduating. I told him to take pictures, bring back stories, and enjoy the hell out of it. I meant that too, in a strange way. If anyone was going to soak up that sun, it may as well be him. But I also meant something else, that he would return to a version of life that no longer included me in quite the same way. The rest of that week was quiet. They started planning outfits and activities. Mom went shopping for travel-sized toiletries and new sandals. Dad Googled snorkeling tours and all-you-can-eat seafood buffets. No one asked what I'd be doing that week. No one even hinted at checking in. It was like I'd become a neighbor. Not a son, someone polite and useful, but not essential. And when they left, luggage rolling across the driveway, sunglasses already on, they waved at me like I was watering the plants for them, like I was the responsible one, the dependable ghost who always stayed behind. Mason turned around as they were getting into the car and said, "Wish you were coming, man," with that same smile he'd had since we were kids. And for a second, just one damn second, I wanted to believe he meant it. But then he was gone, and the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I'd had since high school, and I looked around the room that still smelled like grease from work and faint air freshener from the shop. And I realized, clear as day, that I'd spent my whole life waiting for the next time. For the invite. For the acknowledgement. For the damn thank you that never came. And in that silence, something inside me clicked. Not a loud sound. Not a dramatic moment. Just the smallest realization that if I kept playing this game, I'd die without ever having lived outside of their rules. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't punch the wall or scream into a pillow. I just made a plan. Quiet. Surgical. Deliberate. Because pretending it didn't hurt had never stopped the bleeding. So I smiled. And made sure there wouldn't be a next time. There was no grand outburst, no dramatic confrontation, no slamming of doors or plates crashing against walls like you'd see in movies where characters finally hit their breaking point. No, my unraveling was a quiet one. More like a string being slowly pulled from the hem of an old sweater, almost invisible if you weren't paying close attention. I didn't make a scene, because scenes require an audience, and my audience had always been more interested in watching Mason shine than noticing whether or not I was even standing in the room. The first thing I did was mute the family group chat, not leave it, just silence it, so I could still see what they were saying but didn't feel the buzz in my pocket every time they sent a photo of the beach or a snapshot of Mason eating lobster by the ocean. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking I'd stormed out. No, I was still there, in the background, but the sound was off and my hands were no longer reaching to respond. For the first time in years, I gave myself permission not to perform. It was almost laughable how long it took for anyone to notice. Days turned into a week, and no one sent a message directly to me. It was always, "Look at the sunset," or "Mason, you've got to post that to your Instagram," or "Best ceviche ever." Like they were all starring in a travel show that had no space for guest appearances. My silence was just more of what they already expected from me: agreeable, detached, stable Cal, the one who didn't require maintenance or praise. When they came back, sunburned and glowing and full of stories about sea turtles and frozen cocktails, I was already beginning the process of untying every knot they'd ever used to keep me tethered to them. I didn't ask about the trip, didn't ask for souvenirs, didn't ask if they missed me. I nodded when they spoke and smiled in all the right places, and inside, I started taking inventory of my life, of my worth, of the parts of myself I'd traded just to stay in orbit around people who only looked my way when something broke. It wasn't bitterness, not exactly. It was more like clarity, the kind that comes after a long fever finally breaks and the sweat cools your skin. I stopped calling unless it was necessary. When Thanksgiving rolled around, I didn't pack a bag or bake the usual apple pie. I sent a text that read, simply, "Can't come." 2 words. No explanation. And not a single call followed. Not one. I started journaling, which wasn't something I'd ever done before, mostly because I never thought my life was worth recording. But now, I needed a place to set things down, not just events, but moments, feelings, wounds I hadn't known had names. I wrote about the time Mason broke the window with a baseball and I took the blame without question. I wrote about the look on my mother's face when she said, "At least one of you turned out okay," the night Mason got accepted to college, and I told them I was going to trade school. I wrote about birthdays forgotten and favors remembered, about being the one who drove to pick up Mason from parties when he was too drunk to stand, and never hearing a thank you that felt like more than an afterthought. One sentence kept surfacing again and again, like it was chiseling itself into the center of the page without my permission. "If no one sees you when you're here, maybe they'll feel you when you're gone." It became something of a mantra, not out of spite, but out of the aching realization that absence might carry more weight than presence ever did. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted to matter, and if I couldn't matter while standing in front of them, maybe I could matter by removing myself completely. I began changing things slowly. I stopped sending Christmas cards. I removed myself from family autopay plans. I changed my mailing address to a P.O. box and listed my business number under a generic LLC name. It was all technical at first, little steps toward making myself smaller on paper and then smaller in their lives. And then came the box. It wasn't wrapped in anything special, just a plain, brown cardboard box addressed to Mason. I didn't include a note. Inside were a few things: an old wristwatch I'd borrowed from him 10 years ago and never returned, a framed photo of the two of us as kids on our bikes, and a copy of my journal entries, not all of them, just the ones about him. I wanted him to see it, to read what I remembered, to feel the contrast between his sunshine and my shade. Not because I thought he'd understand, but because I thought maybe, just maybe, something in those words would make him pause. There was no dramatic click of a lighter, no torching of bridges. Just a quiet disengagement. A man slipping off stage after spending years holding up the curtain for someone else's spotlight. I didn't wait for his reply. I didn't check the tracking number. I didn't hover near the mailbox for a letter that would never come. I mailed the box, then went back to my own quiet corner of the world, where no one asked how my day was or offered to split the last piece of pie, and for once it felt peaceful. Because somewhere deep down, past all the guilt and quiet disappointments, I had finally accepted the truth. Some people never notice the weight you carry until you set it down and walk away. And as I sealed the tape on that box and handed it to the postal clerk with a calm that surprised even me, I thought again of that single sentence: if no one sees you when you're here, maybe they'll feel you when you're gone. And this time, I didn't just believe it. I lived it. When they pulled back into the driveway that Sunday evening, still tanned and laughing over something Mason had said at the airport, the house looked exactly the same on the outside, but there was a weight hanging in the air that none of them noticed until the front door opened. You know how sometimes a space just feels off the moment you step inside, like something is missing, even if all the furniture's in place and the lights still work? That's what it felt like. My mom was the first to say it out loud, her words just floating in the quiet air like dust motes in the sunlight. "It's too quiet." Normally, I would have been there before them, maybe washing up after a shift or watching some show halfway through on the living room TV. Not waiting, not excited, but present. The kind of presence they could lean on, not celebrate. But that day, the room was still and untouched, like no one had lived in it for weeks. There were no shoes by the door. No dishes in the sink. No jacket thrown over the chair like I usually left it. My father walked into the kitchen, looked around, opened the fridge, then closed it again like the silence might spill out if he left it open too long. It took them another hour to call me. Mason was the first. He used that same voice he always used when trying to smooth things over, like he already sensed something was off, but wasn't ready to confront it head-on. "Hey man, you okay?" his voicemail said. "You're kind of freaking everyone out. Just let me know you're good, yeah? No big deal." But his voice cracked a little at the end, and I bet he didn't even realize it. What they didn't know, and what I didn't tell them, was that I'd been planning my exit for months. The box I mailed Mason wasn't a spontaneous act of hurt. It was part of a larger pattern, a tapestry I'd been weaving thread by thread until it could finally hold my weight and pull me out. I'd already emptied my apartment, sold what I didn't need, packed my truck with essentials, and left town 2 days before they landed back on American soil. I'd put in notice at the garage weeks ago, citing family matters in the most ironic sense possible, and I'd deactivated every social account tied to my name, every reminder of the digital version of a life no one cared to engage with in real time. It wasn't just about disappearing physically. It was about making sure I no longer existed in the roles they had assigned to me. The good son. The backup. The one who didn't need anything. I had played that part so well for so long that no one even noticed when I started writing myself out of the script. They assumed I'd always be there, like the spare tire in the trunk you forget exists until you're stranded on the side of the road. Mason left another message. This one was shorter, more serious. Okay, now I'm really starting to worry. Mom's crying. Dad's pissed, obviously. Just call me. Please. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not because I hated them, and not because I wanted them to suffer. I just needed the silence to speak louder than my words ever had. I needed them to finally ask the question they'd never bothered to before. What happened to Cal? 2 days after that, they came to my apartment. The building manager let them in because I'd given him notice and hadn't left any forwarding information. They walked in expecting to find me slumped on the couch, or maybe sleeping off some existential meltdown. Instead, they found bare walls, a clean kitchen, and a folded envelope on the counter with family written across the front in my handwriting, blocky and neat, the kind of careful penmanship you use when you want to be understood. I don't know what they expected to find inside that envelope, a suicide note, maybe, or some kind of angry diatribe full of blame and fire. But what I left them wasn't rage. It was quieter than that. It was controlled. It was surgical. I wrote, "This isn't about punishment. This isn't a cry for help. This is just me finally stepping off the stage you built and never let me decorate. I've spent most of my life playing the role you needed, not the person I am. I've carried the weight of being okay so all of you could be comfortable. And now I'm laying it down." I didn't explain where I was going because the truth is, I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had no destination, only distance. I had no itinerary, only the knowledge that whatever waited for me had to be better than the slow erosion of self I'd been enduring for decades. My mother, I imagine, sat on the floor of that empty apartment and wept into her hands, asking herself what she missed. My father probably paced in silence, clenching his jaw, angry that I'd done something he couldn't control or understand. Mason, though, I think he stood there staring at that letter, reading it again and again, looking for a line where he could rewrite the ending. But the ending had already happened. It didn't explode. It faded. And that's what scared them most. Because I didn't yell and I didn't beg. I simply walked away. And they never saw it coming. I never expected the letter to fix anything, and I certainly didn't expect it to make anyone cry, but I knew, without a doubt, that it would haunt them. Not because it was cruel, and not because it lashed out in the ways people often do when they feel abandoned or betrayed, but because it was quiet, precise, and honest in a way our family had never been. Most of our lives were built around avoiding the uncomfortable truth, around painting over cracks with pleasantries and dismissing pain as personality flaws. In our house, silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was strategy. And my letter cut right through it. I had written it a few days before I left, not in some burst of emotion, but over several hours, each line crafted like a mechanic calibrating an engine carefully, with purpose, knowing that even one misaligned bolt could wreck the whole system. It began simply, like all dangerous things do. "Dear family," I wrote, because calling them Mom, Dad, and Mason suddenly felt too familiar for what had become, over the years, something closer to a polite distance than any kind of real bond. You might be wondering why the apartment is empty, why I haven't answered your calls, why I left. I didn't tell them everything. That wasn't the point. The point was to make them feel the outline of my absence and force them to question its shape. I reminded them of things that had long since been brushed under the rug, things they might not have even considered memorable at the time. I brought up my 14th birthday, how Mason got a new bike, and I got a pair of socks. I mentioned the night my car broke down on the side of the freeway and no one answered when I called, so I walked 6 miles in the rain while Mason was posting selfies from a college party. You always said Mason was easy to love, I wrote, the pen digging a little harder into the paper, not out of rage but finality. I believed you. I believed it every single time you smiled at him first. Every time you clapped for him and said, "We're just so proud of you." Every time I came home with news and you changed the subject back to him. I stopped asking for your attention because I learned early that it had already been given away. The next paragraph was trickier, not because it was hard to say, but because I had to be careful not to make it sound like a plea or some sort of emotional manipulation. I didn't want to guilt them into loving me differently. I just wanted them to understand the cost of what they'd always called normal. I wanted them to see that their version of love had casualties, and I had spent most of my life being the one bleeding quietly in the background. I'm not angry, I wrote, and that was true. This isn't a tantrum. This isn't revenge. This is peace. It's me choosing something better than waiting around for crumbs at a table that was never set for me. It's me acknowledging that I have spent over 30 years earning a type of approval you never planned to give. You called it strength when I didn't cry. You called it maturity when I didn't complain. But what it really was silence. And it's over now. I didn't know what they'd feel when they read those lines, but I knew what I felt writing them. Wait. Yes, but also something close to relief. Like standing up after sitting in the same uncomfortable position for too long and feeling the blood rush back into your legs. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt foreign and then, finally, real. I told them about the little things that hurt the most because it's always the little things that do. I mentioned how Mason got the guest room with the queen bed every Christmas while I slept on the pull-out couch, even though I was older. I mentioned how every family photo on the mantle had Mason in the middle and me on the edge, cut off in more than just framing. I mentioned the time I got the lead role in the school play and no one came because Mason had a swim meet the same night. You always told me I was strong, I wrote in one of the last paragraphs. And I am. But strong doesn't mean invincible. Strong doesn't mean invisible. Strong just means I kept showing up, even when it hurt. And now, I'm choosing to stop showing up. And then came the line I knew would stay with them, whether they admitted it or not. The kind of line that sticks in your throat when you try to read it aloud. Please stop looking for me. I'm not lost. I left. That was the whole truth, packed into 9 simple words. I hadn't disappeared in some frantic breakdown. I hadn't been kidnapped by grief or resentment. I had looked at the life I'd been offered, one built on compromise, silence, and second place, and I had walked away from it like someone walking out of a burning house that no one else was willing to admit was on fire. I didn't sign the letter with love. That would have been dishonest. I didn't sign it with hate either. That would have been too easy. I just signed it with my name, the name they never seemed to say with the same softness they used for Mason. And then I sealed the envelope, placed it on the counter, and walked out the door without looking back. Because sometimes leaving isn't about drama or anger or even pain. Sometimes it's about recognizing that your worth isn't a prize someone else gets to hand you. It's about taking what little is left of yourself and saying, "This is mine, and I'm not asking for permission to keep it anymore." And for the first time in my life, that truth was more than enough. The letter sat in the middle of the dining room table like a landmine that had already gone off but was still somehow ticking. My mom read it first, her hands shaking so hard the paper rustled like dry leaves caught in wind. She didn't get halfway through before her shoulders began to tremble, and she dropped her face into her palms, sobbing in short, helpless bursts that had no rhythm or dignity, just pure, stinging grief. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. He didn't cry, he didn't even blink, but the vein in his temple throbbed like something was about to rupture. He kept pacing the room like he was waiting for someone to hand him the right way to feel, and when no one did, he defaulted to the only emotion he ever seemed to understand: anger. "He should have just talked to us," he said, over and over again, like repetition could make it true, like he believed the offer to talk had ever actually been on the table. "This is dramatic. He's always been so sensitive." My mom couldn't speak for a while, just rocked back and forth in her chair like she was trying to soothe herself the way she once had with Mason when he was little and had night terrors. But this wasn't a nightmare someone could shake off. This was the real thing. The reckoning that comes when years of denial finally pull the roof down on top of you. Mason sat at the end of the table, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet like it might offer him answers. He hadn't said much since they returned, other than a few stunned phrases: "I don't get it," and "Why would he just vanish?" But as the weight of the letter settled over the house like dust on untouched furniture, something inside him began to shift. Slowly, uncomfortably, like a muscle waking up after years of misuse. He picked up the letter again, scanning the lines not with confusion this time, but with something closer to shame. Because the thing was, he had seen it. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. Enough to know that Cal's silence hadn't been born overnight. It had been growing in the background of every holiday, every conversation, every damn group photo where Cal stood off to the side like someone who had arrived late and wasn't sure he belonged. Mason remembered one Thanksgiving when Cal brought his homemade pie and nobody touched it because Mom had bought one from that fancy bakery she liked, and everyone pretended not to notice. He remembered when Cal tried to talk about his business expanding and Dad cut him off mid-sentence to ask Mason about his new job offer. He remembered, too, how Cal would always laugh along, always shrug, always act like it didn't matter. But it did. God, it did. That night, Mason sat alone in his childhood bedroom, scrolling through his phone, realizing Cal had vanished from every traceable place. No social media. No business listing. No forwarding number. No new address. He felt the panic rising in his chest like a tide he couldn't outrun. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper. A realization that he'd never really known his brother, not in the way he thought he had. He knew Cal's routines, his habits, even his favorite beer, but not his hurt. Not his need. When they finally decided to hire a private investigator, it was Mason who pushed for it. Not because he thought Cal was in danger, but because he needed to know something, even if it wasn't what he wanted to hear. The PI wasn't cheap, and my father resisted at first, muttering about how this was all unnecessary and overblown. But Mason stared him down, his voice quieter than usual, but more solid than it had ever sounded. "We ignored him long enough. I'm not doing it again." The report came back in less than 2 weeks. Cal had closed his accounts, sold his truck, rented a car with cash, and left the state. The trail ended at a small town in New Mexico, where he'd stayed at a motel under a different name for 3 nights, paid in full, no questions asked. Since then, nothing. No paper trail. No digital fingerprint. He had truly and expertly disappeared. My mother cried again when they read the report, this time not with confusion, but with helplessness. "He didn't want to be found," she whispered, as if saying it out loud made it more real. My father didn't speak for a long while after that. Just stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the world outside keep spinning like nothing had changed. But it had. Something had broken in their orbit, and they were only just starting to understand that it wasn't coming back. That night, Mason stayed up late, sitting in the kitchen with the letter in one hand and his phone in the other. He stared at Cal's words over and over again, trying to find the sentence that would let him undo it all. But no sentence came, no fix, no invitation to make it right. Just that final line, "Please stop looking for me. I'm not lost. I left." And so, sometime past midnight, he opened the voice memo app on his phone, The one he usually used for work notes or half-finished song lyrics he never showed anyone and hit record. His voice was low, almost hushed, like he was speaking to someone sitting right beside him even though the room was empty. Hey, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I don't even know if you care. But I needed to say it anyway. You were always there for me. Even when I didn't ask. Even when I didn't thank you. And I think I got used to that. Used to you just being there. I'm sorry, Cal. I really am. Please, just tell me what to do. He paused at the end, hand hovering over the screen, then saved it and did nothing with it. He didn't send it. He didn't share it. He just let it sit there, like a message in a bottle tossed into the ocean of guilt that now lived inside him. Because sometimes, even the people closest to you only realize what you meant once you're no longer around to explain it. And Mason, who had always been easy to love, finally felt what it meant to be left behind. Weeks passed in that house, the air thick with questions no one wanted to speak out loud, and still no one heard from me. It was like I had been erased, not just removed physically but gently scrubbed from the script entirely, as if I had never played a role worth remembering. My mother had stopped asking aloud where I might be, though her eyes still searched the driveway every time a car slowed down in front of the house. My father returned to his routines, coffee at 6, news by 7, silence by 8, but even he no longer had the energy to disguise the dread that lived in the pauses between his words. Mason, though, he was the one unraveling in slow motion, the guilt wrapping around his ribs like a belt tightening one notch at a time. The voicemail he recorded sat unsent on his phone, untouched but never deleted. Some nights he played it back, not to edit or review it, but to sit in the sound of his own regret. He listened to his own voice crack at the end, heard the way the silence swallowed the final sentence, and wondered what I might have done if I'd heard it. But I hadn't. I hadn't heard it, and more importantly, I hadn't wanted to, because for the first time in my life, I was somewhere else, somewhere warm and dry, and absolutely, gloriously silent. No obligations. No expectations. No one calling me just to ask about Mason. It was in the middle of that silence that I decided to respond, not with words or apologies or explanations, but with something simpler, a photo. I took it myself, using the 10-second timer on an old digital camera I'd found in a thrift store in Arizona. I set it up on a flat rock just off a dirt road near the edge of the desert, the kind of place where no one would find you unless they were lost themselves. Behind me, the landscape stretched wide and endless, all cracked red earth and stubborn brush, a horizon that didn't ask for anything from anyone. In the photo, I'm smiling, not a forced smile, not the tight-lipped performance I used to wear like armor, but a small, quiet smile, the kind you give yourself when you realize, for the first time in decades, that you don't owe anyone anything anymore. I wasn't posing for them. I wasn't sending them proof of life. I was sending them a mirror. On the back of the photo, I wrote one sentence in permanent ink, the kind that doesn't fade no matter how many hands touch it or how many times it's folded and unfolded. You never noticed when I was next to you. Why do you care now? I mailed it without a return address, of course, just a plain envelope with Mason's name on the front. No card, no letter, no explanation, just that single image and the truth written on the back like a question they would never be able to answer honestly. I imagined the moment he opened it, sitting at the kitchen table or maybe in his car parked outside his job, hands trembling just a little as he turned the photo over. I didn't need to see it. I didn't need to be there. Because the power wasn't in the reaction, it was in the absence that came before it, the echo of all the times I had been there, right beside them and still invisible. They had spent their lives learning how to overlook me, and now they had to live with what it felt like when someone you took for granted becomes someone you can't find. Was it justice? Maybe. But it wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty, even if that's how it felt to them. It was something colder and cleaner than that, consequence. The natural result of years of neglect and dismissal dressed up as tradition and family values. They had mistaken my silence for agreement, my presence for peace, and my loyalty for comfort. They were wrong about all of it, and I knew deep down I would be painted as the one who left, the one who walked out on his family, the one who couldn't handle being less loved. I accepted that. Hell, I welcomed it. Because if being a ghost meant freedom, then I had never been more alive. When Mason finally showed the photo to our parents, my mother cried, of course, clutching the image like it might somehow bring me back if she just held it tightly enough. My father didn't speak for a long time, but when he did, it was just one line: he doesn't want to come back. Mason didn't respond, just stared at the image for a long time, turning it over again and again in his hands, like he was trying to see a version of me he'd never really known. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the lights were off, Mason stood alone in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe of my old bedroom. The room hadn't changed. The same posters on the wall. The same drawer that never quite closed right. The bed still made like I was coming home any minute, which we all knew I wasn't. He whispered something then, not to the room, not even to himself, but into the air like it might reach me somehow, wherever I was. Maybe we were the problem. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. Or maybe it was too late. Either way, I wasn't there to answer. It had been exactly 1 year to the day since Mason received that photo, the one with my smile in the desert, that half-smirk of quiet freedom beneath an endless sky, paired with the sentence that stung more than any insult ever could. A full 365 days had passed, and still, not a word, not a sighting, not even a whisper through the family grapevine. Mason had stopped checking the mailbox obsessively months ago, stopped dialing my number just to hear it disconnect, stopped refreshing old emails like a ghost might type back if he waited long enough. But on his 29th birthday, a small, plain envelope arrived with his name handwritten across the front in my blocky, deliberate print, the same way I'd labeled his lunchbox in grade school after Mom forgot. There was no return address, no postage stamp beyond the basics. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just paper, like it held some kind of emotional gravity. Mason didn't open it right away. He sat with it for a few hours, turning it over in his hands, trying to figure out if he even wanted what was inside. Some part of him had already begun to bury me in the place we store people we might never get back, not in hatred, not even in anger, but in resignation. You can only grieve an unanswered question for so long before it starts to feel like trying to hold smoke in your hands. When he finally tore it open, the letter inside was written in the same neat penmanship I'd used in the first one, except this time there were no sharp edges, no memories dragged out like weapons, no accusations waiting to explode. This time, it read like something steadier, not soft, but steady, the tone of someone who had found what they were looking for and wasn't sure if he owed anyone an explanation. "Hey, Mason," it began, like we were picking up a conversation instead of starting one after a year of silence. "I didn't forget your birthday. I just didn't know if I had the right to say anything anymore. But I figured 1 year seems like enough time to let the dust settle." I hadn't written with any intention of rekindling something or reopening old wounds. I wrote because part of me still wanted to be understood, not forgiven, not embraced, just seen clearly for once in my life. "I don't hate you," I continued, and Mason paused when he read that line, like the paper had suddenly gotten heavier. "I never did. I think, if anything, I was just tired of living in a world where love had to be earned in ways you never had to think about. And that's not your fault, not really. You didn't choose to be the favorite. You just existed in the shape that made their love easier. And I existed in the shadow it cast." I told him about the year I'd spent away, not with exact locations or names, just images. I described the quiet towns I passed through, the late-night diners where no one knew me, the peace I found in silence and simple work. I mentioned learning to live off less and still feeling like I had more. I talked about sleeping under open skies and waking up without dread. I didn't say it to brag or make him jealous. I said it because for the first time in my life, I had felt real calm. And I needed him to know that calm didn't come from being surrounded by family. It came from finally stepping outside the roles they had all handed me. I like peace more than I like pretending, I wrote, and that sentence hit him harder than he expected. Because he knew, finally, what pretending had cost me. He saw the moments now, all the ones he had laughed off, all the times he mistook my silence for stoicism and realized they had been warnings, small fires he never bothered to put out. The letter wasn't long. Barely 2 pages. But it was enough to knock the wind out of him in a different way than the first one had. There was no bloodletting this time. Just the gentle setting down of a burden. And near the end, I gave him what he hadn't asked for, but maybe hoped for in the quietest corner of his guilt. This isn't goodbye, I wrote, then crossed out the word and rewrote it below. Or maybe it is. I don't really know. I guess that part's not up to me anymore. It depends on what you want, and if what you want is real. I'm not coming back to be the same brother you remember. I won't live in that shadow again. But maybe, if you can see me clearly now, for who I really am, not who I was supposed to be, then maybe this doesn't have to be the end. And then I signed it, just Cal, no flourish. No love always. Just my name, as it had always been, finally standing on its own without needing to be attached to anyone else's. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, almost like an afterthought, I added one final line. This is goodbye, unless it's not. Mason folded the letter 3 times and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't cry. He didn't jump to action. He just sat there with it in his lap, letting the weight of it settle into his bones. The decision wasn't mine anymore. That had been the point all along. I had made my choice, and now he had to make his. Because what do you do when the ghost you lost sends you a door instead of a grave? Do you walk through it? Do you knock first? Or do you stare at it forever, afraid of what might be waiting on the other side? Mason didn't know yet. And neither did I. But sometimes, the choice is the story. And sometimes, silence says more than coming home ever could.